Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 p.m., and so we will get started. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Natalie MacLeod Schroeder to you for this Illuminate presentation. Natalie is one of our course family, and just a little bit of background about her. Some of you may not know these things, so I think it's always useful to let you know a little bit about the speaker. Natalie is a graduate of what was then the University of Western Ontario and is now Western University in Ontario. She received her BSc in occupational therapy from that institution and then promptly went on and did a research Master of Science degree also at that institution. Um, she came to Manitoba some years ago. I won't say how many, Natalie, um, just to protect your confidentiality here. But during the process of being in Manitoba and being part of the program in occupational therapy here, she was struck with the need to go on and do a PhD, which totally delighted me. And she did it in the Faculty of Education and was part of the transformative teaching, learning, and leading cohort. I had the great privilege of being one of her committee members, and I can tell you that during that experience, the interchanges that Natalie and I had were probably the best seminar experiences I have ever had at the University of Manitoba. They were stimulating, they were intellectually very rich, and they were lots of fun at the same time. Natalie's had a very interesting and varied career in occupational therapy. Immediately after graduation, she worked in adult and child health. When she came to Winnipeg, it was to Health Sciences Center to become the OT clinical specialist in child health. She went on to become the Education Systems and Research Coordinator in Occupational Therapy at HSC, and from there jumped to the WRHA to be the Manager of Clinical Education Initiatives. The University of Manitoba has benefited greatly from Natalie's dynamic presence. She became the director of the clinician assessment programs and now is the director of the Internationally Educated Health Professionals Access Hub. She has also worked for Shared Health during the pandemic. She was and continues to be actually the clinical lead and supervisor of mass immunization clinics. Hello, Natalie. Measles coming up. You may be called upon again. At Chorus, she's had a number of appointments and has been really foundational to many of our courses, not the least of which is the Foundations of Occupational Therapy Theory. Theory courses are traditionally ones that everybody would like to avoid teaching. Natalie jumps in 2 feet right away and has developed, I think, a very credible and program in theory. And in fact, students have even said, I really like theory. That is something that should be enshrined in gold. Natalie is currently the coordinator of the Foundations in Occupational Therapy Theory, and I'm privileged to be a tutorial leader in that program. She's also involved in the professionalism and leadership in enabling occupation in the second year of the MOT program and has been a stalwart in critical inquiry courses over the years. I can tell you that Natalie is student-centered. She's questioning, she's open, she's absolutely passionate about occupational therapy, and she's equally passionate about access to occupational therapy education, and I think by stretching that is to health professionals education, and that's what she's going to talk to us about today. So I will be quiet now, and Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Archie. Hopefully I can live up to that introduction. It's actually terrifying when you start hearing a 3 decade long or plus career, um, and you realize where what all has gone on. Um, Thank you everybody for coming. Um, as Archie has indicated, the education of health, occupational therapy students, the education of occupational therapists has been something that has been a passion of mine actually for probably more than 20 years at this point in time, and is where I came from in terms of going back to do my PhD, originally actually focusing on clinicians, but certainly now taking that work as a full-time instructor here, and thinking about educating our students and who our students are. So I'm going to really try to share my slides. I'm realizing how much of my pandemic skills are a little rusty. Now, I struggled with what to call this presentation. So I went through about 26 different versions, and ultimately came up with this concept of more than accommodations. And I think that's actually the bulk of what my presentation is going to be, is really about the challenges of accommodations, and how there's really an imperative in our health professional education. My focus being occupational therapy, but as Archie has indicated, is really about accessibility in health professional education for all of the students. My experience is just based majority in occupational therapists. So a couple of heads up and considerations in this. Some of you may have heard the first part of this presentation. The invite, I believe, came as a result of an address I did at the CAOT, the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapy conference, last May in Saskatoon. At least I think that's where we were now. Where I was invited, I was given a soapbox for 10 minutes and able to speak about anything that I wanted to, and really talked about what I had been experiencing in my career that I've reflected on in the last number of years, and what I have been seeing in our students and the struggles with our students. So for those of you who have read this in the OT now, or have heard that presentation, I will apologize. The first bit of this is going to be repetitive for you. You could zone out, get a coffee. That's just great. But I didn't want to get rid of it, because as part of my passion for this really was expressed in that presentation. So the first part is really going to connect with my personal experiences, and the next part is really going to talk specifically about the concept of accommodations related to both to University of Manitoba and broadly with disabled students, and then looking at what I'm meaning when I'm thinking about moving to more of an accessibility frame for us. Our professions, specifically looking at occupational therapy, but within College of Rehab Sciences, so physiotherapy and respiratory therapy, are certainly being pushed by, and rightly so, by a changing culture, a changing context, a changing understanding, to increase the representation, to increase the diversity of our professions, to more represent the people with whom we work every day. And with that comes an additional sense of challenge from most likely how I was certainly educated, and how a number of us probably were educated, which is really within a very narrow understanding of performance, understanding of the profession. Okay, so that's just really the grounding. I will also tell you that I have a tendency to get somewhat dysregulated in a few of the components, a few of the pieces, because they do mean so much to me. So that's kind of my entry. So the first piece certainly is a land acknowledgement. And I would like to recognize that I am here doing this presentation with you on Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba, on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Anisininu, the Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, on the homeland of the Red River Métis. And I'm here as a white settler, an uninvited guest on these lands. I want to acknowledge that as we as white settlers have not fulfilled either the spirit or the letter of the treaties of which we are party to, and that our actions as settler colonists have created and continue to sustain and maintain past and current oppressive systems that harm Indigenous people, as well as others who live on this land. And it's my pledge to address and work to address these injustices in these systems. So when I was asked, oops, I'm sorry, I'm moving through my slides here. I was asked to do this presentation shortly after my address, as I said, and it's based on my career of more than 3 decades of lived experience as an OT student, as a therapist, and an educator in a larger context. So just so you know, my initial presentation was only 10 minutes. So moving to a longer presentation was a huge challenge for me because it was all based on experience, and I got to be up there and just be on a soapbox, and coming into this presentation has made me have to look at things a little differently. So I want to talk a bit about, to start with, about who I am. I am a passionate occupational therapist. It is a career that has enabled me to have a diverse array of experiences, to work with individuals and groups, and see the place and the need and the meaning in occupation for people. And it is who I am. It is a very strong, very key component of my identity. And it actually has been my entire work in terms of all of my education since high school, in terms of my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, and my PhD. But those of you who know me will also know, or have heard this, also know that I have other identities that I have been more recently willing to share. I am neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with a number of actual neurodivergencies in my 20s after completing my occupational therapy education. And so for those of you who may not be as familiar with the concept of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, what this means is that neurodivergence is a natural variation in neurology, in the presentations of my brain's structure. And it means that I and others who are also neurodivergent will process, receive, interpret, respond to external stimuli, emotional stimuli, sensory stimuli, differently than what is seen by someone who is considered more neurotypical. And it's this neurodivergence that has caused some challenges across my career, and it's caused some challenges with me even building this presentation the first time, and now this second time, trying to find words to express the experience of this, and to do it in a way that represents my experience, my students' experience, and in a way that prevents me from rejection from my peers, that makes me not stand out, that makes sure that the words are right. And it causes a lot of interesting things that can look like procrastination, that can look like disorganization, that are really just the way that my brain works. I also identify as a MAD therapist. And this is a term that I choose willingly and purposefully, in that I have been diagnosed by the system with a number of mental health conditions over the course of my life since I was a teenager. And they have influenced how I've been able to participate in my education as well as in employment, and have created struggles at various points in time. The last piece of my identity that I'm going to share is, in recent years, I've also identified as disabled. So despite the neurodivergence and the mental health challenges, disability was not a lens that I used for myself for much of my life. However, in recent years, I have been diagnosed with a number of impairments that result in chronic pain, intermittent mobility challenges, and energy limitations that affect my performance. So in many ways, my experiences would look on the surface like anyone else, potentially. I am an OT. I love OT. It is why I am here. And I identify very, very strongly with the profession. But I have also felt like an outsider for much of my career. I didn't always fit. And I certainly received feedback within school, from peers, from within employment, from others, about my difference, even when I didn't understand what my difference was. I'm a little bit weird. My communication style is a little bit different. Certainly my physical and emotional regulation are different, and I don't always feel like I fit in. So I've often felt at the periphery of things, despite my feeling like I belong in OT. I feel I'm sometimes out of place. Um, I didn't always fit with my colleagues. I got feedback across my career about my professionalism, my professional behaviors, my awareness of social cues and social norms, how I choose to or am able to respond to various things, my ability to regulate my emotions, my ability to regulate my tone of voice, my rate of speech, my volume. These have been forever challenges, and they continue to this day and in this very speech or in this very presentation. And they're often a point of shame for me. I think about how I'm supposed to be an OT and how I understand concepts of communication and concepts of social behavior. And I've learned them, but I cannot always demonstrate them. They are not a part of my lived experience beyond the cognitive learning that I must present. So on occasion, it's very difficult and often exhausting for me to present in a way that I'm expected to do, to meet those social expectations that are not naturally part of my way of being in the world. They require an additional layer of conscious effort, and often masking or mirroring the behaviors of others to appear to fit in. I was always told, or I was often told, to mask my emotions or to cover my emotions, to not demonstrate emotions, and certainly to not present those different parts of myself earlier on in my career. And I've started to push back. I've started to challenge those voices that told me how I needed to be an OT, that there was one way of being an OT and I wasn't it. I've worked to be my more authentic self in my practice, both clinically as well as in the classroom with my students and my colleagues. I started by being more transparent with my identities because I don't remember seeing anybody like me or hearing about anybody like me in the profession when I was a student or a grad student for that matter. I want to support those who are entering that may have identities different than what is seen as the norm of the professions, that what have been the typical students. I want to make sure there's space for more than one way of being, and that there's voice for people who do not feel like they fit in that box, but are working really, really hard at the expense of themselves. So my experiences with students, again, I'm going to draw on my career in the last number of years. So occupational therapy itself is a profession that is concerned with accessibility. It's about having access to desired and meaningful occupations. And our students often choose occupational therapy, and I believe things like physiotherapy and respiratory therapy as well, because of how our core ideas and beliefs are positioned outside of a medical model. The social model of disability is built into all of our programs. So situating disability outside of the person, that it is the interaction with the environment that is creating disability, not a lack or a difference in the person. And I believe that prospective students are actually attracted to that in our programs, particularly when they have those differences. But what happens is they come into our programs expecting that those values, those beliefs underpin our programs. And that's not always the case. Our programs are in a university structure, probably one of the most colonial structures we could see anywhere. And so our programs are therefore rooted in that colonialism, in whiteness, in ableism, in capitalism, in neoliberal structures that are what is reproduced within the university. And that the students often find us as their educators reproducing these oppressive systems by demanding that their performance occur within a very narrow range of what is acceptable. The students today, which is a little different than when I was a student, do have connections to accessibility services. And despite my critique in this presentation, we need accessibility services. Please, if anybody's here from that accessibility services, this is not a challenge of what you do. This is actually a recognition of that you have far too much to do. So they have access to individual accommodations for disabilities, for things that are challenges for them. But the accommodations themselves are problematic. So long before a disabled student, and I'm using that language very intentionally, so a disabled student, a neurodivergent student, a MAD student, because they don't often identify themselves as disabled. But long before they attend their first class, they have to gather a certain amount of documentation to actually legitimize their need for accommodations. If our students are lucky, this is simply a form that the physician, if they're lucky enough to have one who is able to fill it out, willing to fill out, and supports their needs, their need for supports, they fill out that form to start the process. For some of our students who have learning disabilities, a recent psychoeducational assessment is required from a psychologist. So you can imagine being a student who maybe was diagnosed with a learning disability in elementary school or high school and is now required to go and track down or find or get an assessment of current needs for their learning disability. The current wait time, I believe, for psychological assessments right now is anywhere between 18 months and 24 months, and can cost upwards of $2,000 for an assessment. It's not an easy thing to do. All of these things, can be expensive. Even the doctors will charge for the forms, and they are all doing this to prove their need. Things that they've probably been living with much of their life, but they must prove their need to the university environment. Once our system validates their disability, they then have additional labor of further meetings with advisors and counselors, requirements for additional scheduling deadlines for their tests, challenges of partial disclosure over and over and over again with different instructors and different professors, and fieldwork opportunities, particularly in our programs, to get the extensions, to get the services, to get the accommodations to which they're entitled. And all of that creates an additional burden for students who we know already have difficulty participating fully in the program. Their schedules are tightly packed, and every single one of those appointments and every single one of those meetings adds an additional burden. When they're in the program, if their behavior or their performance does not match the expectations, they often receive feedback in ways that challenge their social and communication skills, their emotional regulation, and sometimes their very identities. And when that feedback is received and not processed or received in a way that we as faculty expect, this is seen as a deficit in the student and not in our teaching processes or our expectations. Our methods of teaching and evaluation often have very specific expectations of presentation or representation, firm and inflexible deadlines, group work that requires additional labor and navigation for particularly neurodivergent students, many of these things which can be challenging. Sometimes our students leave before they finish because it's not the fit that they expected to find. Others remain, but often struggle to find success and belonging within a profession that should accept them. In persisting, they face the further challenges, the very real, very detrimental effects of burnout. Our students are exhausted. They are stressed. They are struggling. Excuse me. And this is in professions that should be welcoming. Their knowledge, their lived experience, this should be a supportive space for them to learn and for us to learn from them. Individual accommodations are not sufficient to meet the needs of neurodivergent, of disabled, of MAD occupational therapy students, or health professional students at large. Accommodations should be for very specific individualized supports that cannot be managed outside the program. They should not be the solution for a lack of access. And we cannot rely on those services to meet the needs of our student population. Our programs and educators, including myself, need to work to embrace different ways of knowing, different ways of being in our professions. We need to reflect on whether what we're requiring of our students reflects truly what they need to know and is not just some replication of what we needed to demonstrate, and how one way of being in this profession. There's a myriad of ways that you can look like an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist or a respiratory therapist. It's not a one size fits all. And certainly with the shift and changes we've seen with technology and work environments in the last number of decades, we see differences in how you can be each of those kinds of things. We need flexible programs and teaching methods and evaluation methods that focus on the strengths of our learners, where there are specific requirements that are required by our professions. And I do believe that there are some of those. If there's a specific way of doing things, we need to be very, very clear about what that way of doing is and what is required of it. We need explicit and transparent rationale and instructions for our students. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move in now to a little bit more of the literature that we know about what it is. So I'm taking it away. Oh, I'm looking at some of my slides that didn't line up properly. I'm moving it away from experience to kind of what we know from literature that looks at accessibility and that looks at accommodations. So when we consider the disabled student experience, what we know and what I see and have expressed to me from students is this additional labor, this additional cognitive load that is associated with being a disabled student. And that can be managing their medical appointments, managing their appointments with accessibility services, managing all of their accommodations, which would include all the documentation, the communication, managing timelines, organizing themselves, and learning and managing new assistive technology to assist with their disability, managing their own medications, their own transportation, etc., on top of the work that's involved in just being an OT student. Okay, so this is an additional burden that our non-disabled students are not experiencing. Disabled students entering health professions, we do not have a lot of great data on them because it's a small number. It's slowly growing, but it's still a small percentage of the students we have accessibility data on across the country. But what we do know, at least anecdotally, is that disabled students entering the healthcare professions face greater challenges. So if they're disabled before they come in, they're facing greater challenges than those students who actually acquire disabilities during our programs or after their programs. And that comes from some of our pre-existing biases, our attitudes of ourselves, our faculty, our peers, the preceptors, how accessible accommodations are, and the work that's required to legitimize their disability when it's comes in pre admission to our programs. My does not equal sign has moved when I changed my color of my slides, but diversity does not equal inclusion. The fact that we have more students who are disabled in our programs does not mean that our students feel more included. It means that we've actually done recruitment efforts and we are moving ourselves out to bring students in, but that does not mean that those students feel like they're included and find our environment an inclusive and welcoming space. The literature on graduate students tells us that students with disabilities at the graduate level experience lower levels of satisfaction and have more challenges navigating academic, professional development, and social environments within the universities compared with their non-disabled peers. And much of this comes from that additional burden, that additional labor that's required, as well as things like stigma, as well as things like implicit bias. We know that there are attitudinal barriers in our academic environments, particularly those with STEM students, of which many of ours would come from, as well as those in the health-related field, which is all of us here. There are things like this gatekeeping under this guise of maintaining academic integrity and academic rigor of what is absolutely required and what must you be able to do to be an occupational therapist, a physiotherapist. We often hear conversations about we're preparing them for the workplace. But I'm not sure that's the job of a university. It certainly is the job to give them the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes and behaviors, but the workplace is diverse. Students may not want to work full-time on graduation. Students may seek out and choose different environments, but when they're here in ours, they cannot leave, they cannot choose, they cannot move. And we're gatekeeping under this guise of thou shalt in order to maintain our own academic standards. It comes from places of implicit bias of what it takes to be any one of these health professionals. It comes from a sense of stigma, and it results in challenges across the educational experience for disabled students. There's a presumption of universality of some of our skills. We certainly see this with our typical students, our traditional students. We have this expectation of how they use technology and how fluent they are. And our students that are coming in with these are usually learning often behind in those pieces or don't have those because there was a lack of access for them prior. So they're having to learn all of these additional skills and technology. They're having to figure out these experiences that they didn't have, that typical students haven't, or target students haven't, or the social capital that other students have that they don't have. And they're not considered, we're not considering the lived experience that those students bring to our context. This one always surprises me. It's the discrimination, the stigma, and the self-stigma. The number of students I've had come into my office and chat about where they're struggling and what's going on, and ultimately finally disclose health conditions, impairments, life circumstances, and they're terrified. They're terrified of being seen as different. They're terrified of being seen as not capable. They get pushback or challenges about their accommodations or about disclosure or about how we think of them because we treat our students differently than what we would ever do with a client. Okay? We require something from them that we do not require of our clients, and that is their own autonomy, their own independence, their own self-efficacy, which we don't require of our clients the same way. And that internalized self-stigma, that discrimination and fear of discrimination from their peers, from their preceptors, from their faculty often prevent students from getting the supports that they need. Accommodation programs currently demand a lot in terms of self-advocacy. However, that's an additional skill, and many of our students have not developed it. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of emotional labor to be able to do that. And then there's things like the funding models that we have. So it is fantastic that in Manitoba, we certainly have models where we can get bursaries and we can get funding for adaptive equipment or assistive devices, assistive tech, other kinds of services for our disabled students, but it's not accessible to all. Students who are international students, of which I know we only have a few, are not eligible for any of those grants and therefore don't have eligible access to the same technology that a Canadian citizen student would have access to. Katzman, who's an occupational therapist who actually is at Western Ontario University, Western University, I can't get used to the new name, did a study with a number of OT colleagues, or actually colleagues in various health professionals, looking at the additional load of being a disabled student in a health professional program specifically. So the previous data was looking at a national survey of disabled students. This is about health professional students, specifically in Canada. And what they see are 5 different categories that overlap and flood into each other, but looking at these different kinds of work of being a disabled student. So that proving of disability. So they have to learn to navigate the system. Many students who are neurodivergent don't think of themselves as having a disability, same with things like anxiety disorders, depression, etc. It's not thought of as a disability, and having to go and legitimize that and then navigate a system that they're not used to doing is a whole new amount of learning. They have to make and attend appointments. They have to attend for testing. They may have to weigh the risks and benefits of even going through the system, knowing how much work it is and the risks that they feel with disclosure. And they have to be engaged constantly in self-advocacy. Being a disabled student in a health professional program means an additional load around identity and how they grapple with the identity and the consistency between a disability identity and a health professional identity. And many are looking at redefining their sense of themselves within that disability identity, and learning about that identity themselves and reconciling that with what does it actually mean to be an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist or a respiratory therapist or a physician or a nurse or a medical technician. There's a lot of work around disclosure, managing the perceptions, anticipating consequences of disclosing a disability. How are my faculty going to respond? How are my peers going to respond? Weighing those risks and benefits. How do I time it? Am I safe? And ultimately a lot of work of masking. And then there's the negotiating. We often ask the students what they need for accommodations, but they're coming into programs that look very, very different than their undergrad programs or their previous schooling in the case of entry at an undergrad level, and they don't know what they need. And then they have to advocate for themselves, and they have to communicate their needs repeatedly, and they have to teach others about their needs. And they have to balance their own assertiveness with maintaining supportive allies in their professions and in their classes. And then there's just the work of living with the impairments. And I can absolutely relate to this one, not being a student at the moment, is learning to manage my own symptoms on top of the work of being an instructor, learning to manage my own systems or just managing my own symptoms on top of the work. I fatigue more quickly. It takes me longer to process certain things. I don't think in a linear fashion, so then I have to push myself into those. And that living with those impairments, living with those differences is an additional amount of labor on top of our typical students who don't have to do that work. Okay, let's look at a little bit about what we know about U of M. So this is based, the data is going to come from different sources, but most of it's coming from the annual reports of both Student Accessibility Services as well as Student Affairs. So this is based on the 2019-2021 SAS annual report, which is the most recent one we have. And it's looking at the students registered with accessibility services broadly across the campus. 50% of students in 2019 to 2021 actually were registered with a mental health condition. So they're coming in and they're registering with conditions that are affecting their ability to concentrate, to think, to have energy, to manage anxiety, to manage emotional regulation. 26% fall into what SAS calls cognitive, and I would probably call in many cases neurodivergent. Autism, ADHD or ADD, acquired brain injuries, learning disabilities. So those are in the cognitive group. 14% are what they call physical or medical. So we think about these as physical impairments that may limit mobility, may be energy depleting, may cause fatigue, may cause pain or chronic pain conditions. And then there's another, I've grouped this as other, they have another smaller breakdown, but this is people with, this would be students with hearing impairments, visual impairments, and other kind of not categorizable diagnoses that would fit in there. One of the important things to know is that almost a quarter of all students registered with SAS identify as having more than one disability, which means that their needs are that much more complicated by the different impairments, different identities, and the interaction of those. So from Student Affairs, this one would just staggered me. In 2023, there were 2,385 students in the university registered with SAS. Okay, that was an increase from the previous year of 18%. The accessibility coordinator ratio to student, so registered SAS student ratio, is 1 to 400. So if there's any SAS coordinators in there, give yourself a pat on the back, because that is a caseload that is not manageable. That means for every 400 students, there's one person helping them navigate this process, having them navigate and negotiate their accommodations. One. The recommended ratio nationally is 1 to 100 students. We're not even close. When we look at accommodations, people have seen these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the most requested ones are usually related to exams and assignments. SAS, every single time an examination comes through that they have to help with in terms of space, in terms of invigilation, extra time, that SAS is working to try and find space. There is no dedicated space at Bannatyne campus. So that's all of course students. They are providing invigilation. They don't have enough bodies to provide invigilation. So many, actually, the accessibility coordinators are giving up time to go and do other things to actually invigilate students. And then the additional work of our SAS coordinators here on this campus is the complex needs of professional programs, because we look different. We have higher loads, we have field work, we have different kinds of things that require accommodations beyond what your typical undergraduate arts or science student would have. And just as a matter of reference, because we can pull this one piece of data out, in 2021, 2020, 2019, 2020 to 21, but 32 students were per year registered with SAS across our 3 programs, which represents about, by my math, about 10 to 12%, which I think is low. So the common accommodations, as I said, I put the most requested ones there. These accommodations that are in italics are ones that relate more to learning or classroom environments. The ones that are in standard font are about assessment. So we saw the ones about exams, things like note-taking. That's about 1/3 of SAS students have some kind of note-taking, and much of it relies on volunteer note-takers, which are often not found, or they're inconsistent. Note takers start off at the beginning of the year, but they're not uploading things consistently because students get busy. There's inconsistency in the quality of the notes, and actually sometimes we don't have any student volunteers, and interestingly enough, faculty don't know when we don't have student volunteers to take notes. They have accommodations for absences, which is really interesting in programs with attendance policies like our programs, which can create challenges. Things like accessible documents, textbooks, or instructor materials. Reduced loads are a possible one, challenging in our programs. And then things like transcription services. These are standard accommodations across the country, and that's usually what we base our accommodation services in, is what is the norm. As I mentioned, the requirements for registering with accommodations is completing paperwork, including the cost of those, the intake forms, the meetings, the applications, activating their accommodations. So that's sending letters every semester. The student must remember to activate their accommodation for their new instructors and professors. And it has to be done every single term, which brings another round of disclosure with this. And registering for exam space. So there's a deadline of 2 weeks for midterms and finals. SAS does a great job of sending reminders out to students, but they're based on the general calendar, of which CORS often doesn't follow. So they're getting reminders at times when they haven't even started a course potentially to register for their midterms, because their course starts later in the year than the general calendar. So the whole point of this for me is getting into the what's wrong with this picture. I loved this when I found this one on Twitter. Accommodations don't equate to access. So you can see in this picture is that there's a set of stairs. They built a ramp trying to get past that accessibility issue. And we noticed that the door to actually get in opens straight into it. So while we've dealt with one issue, there's just more and more issues that need to be accommodated as we go along. And it's burdensome and it takes a lot of effort. So that comes to, as you've heard a lot of these, is where the problem is with an accommodation model for disability. It centers disability in and as the responsibility of the individual. So that's the medical model. That is the model we've been pushing against actually my entire career, because I remember learning social model of disability when I was an OT student. Okay. And when we work with our clients, most of us don't work from a medical model frame and challenge the medical model. Yet when we with our clients, the collective, the populations, but when we work with our students, we default back to it. It's their responsibility to activate their accommodations. It's their responsibility to advocate for themselves. It's their responsibility to do the paperwork, in addition to already burdened caseload or course loads. Accommodations requires disclosure, which is a challenge. It causes emotional dysregulation. It means a shifting of identity. There's a lot that goes into going through disclosure. It requires legitimization by a health professional, as well as the system. So that's us, the faculty, the academic world, the clinical world. So that student's experience is invalid and must be represented by a medical person who can diagnose to be able to be seen as legitimate. There's inequalities and inequities in who can access accommodations. So people don't have, I've had many students who don't have access to a healthcare provider to be able to fill out paperwork. I'm sending to the student supports here, which is great, but they don't have existing relationship with the students, and it's very hard to figure out what that paperwork should look like and what they're asking for. Many lack resources to pay for the assessments and requirements that they have, or the accommodations that they need. And then there, as I mentioned, there's who qualifies for grants, loans, and bursaries. Accommodations requires a lot of resourcing of accessibility services. It requires a lot of labor on the part of each and every student. So it's 5 hours for one student and 5 hours for the next and 5 hours next. And you have 30 and 40 and 50 hours of time that our students are spending there just for those 5 students. Self-advocacy itself perpetuates discrimination and labeling and that legitimization, as we have to speak up and disclose and label ourselves. And many of our accommodations don't translate to fieldwork. Accessibility services exists to a large extent in the silo. Again, credit to accessibility services. I've worked with a number of the coordinators over there, and they are very happy to work with us, but they're swamped. So it's often limited integration with the faculty. And a lot of our accommodations really relate to assessment and not learning, which is where many of our students also have challenges. So they don't address needs such as executive function challenges that come with many forms of neurodivergence. Lastly, what happens with accommodations is they don't address things outside of legitimated disability. So people who aren't yet diagnosed, who are unwilling to disclose, whose needs are outside the accommodations, but are Indigenous students who may not have the same experiences, knowledge, way of being as our typical students. Black students, students of color, 2S LGBTQIA plus students, newcomers and first generation Canadians, those who may have different experiences, different lived experiences that aren't consistent with our programs. So our professions recognize this need to be equitable, and participation of diverse groups is needed, particularly those who have been systematically oppressed and excluded. And we need to move beyond thinking about headcounts to demonstrate our commitment to this, and think about what we're doing in our classrooms, doing with our policies and processes to make things accessible. We need to shift our conceptualization of disability as a fault in the student or a responsibility in the individual, and that's something actually that needs to be accommodated by the environment. So moving from the medical model to the social model. This decreases the burden on our learners. It will decrease the burden on accessibility services. It enables success for students who aren't and don't identify as disabled, so more diverse learners with different experiences who still experience oppressiveness within our systems. And accessibility is far more proactive than reactive, which is what we're doing with an accommodation model. I do have a number of suggestions. I realize that I'm getting to quarter two, so I am going to go fairly quickly. For faculty, we need to think about and make sure that we are challenging our own assumptions and biases. And here I am as a neurodivergent, mad, disabled person, and I constantly am catching myself of what I'm thinking about. Of, oh, no, they're not going to be able to do that. Oh, they need to be able to do these things. Challenging our own inner assumptions and implicit biases about what difference or disability means. We need to think about these disability, neurodivergence, madness as just natural variation. I know we all teach and talk about learning styles. It's just a different learning styles. It's just more variation in learning styles. It's just a model we're not used to thinking in. We need to find ways to support diverse participation. So technology, learning how to do assessment documents well, flexible assessment deadlines and methods, differentiated instructions. This is the educational theorist person here. We need to center ourselves and ground ourselves in compassionate and relationship-based pedagogies. So we need to be working towards those positive relationships with students and working in collaboration and communication with them. We need to challenge those universal narratives and think about, are we just doing this because it's the way it's always been done, how I was taught, of what I believe the expectations are, and have some flexibility around what those outcomes must look like. It's always asking yourself why. Why are we doing this way? Why does it need to go this way? Why does this assessment or this class need to roll out in the way it is? Where there are absolutes in performance and expectations, we need to be very clear about why and what that is, the rationale and our expectations. And we need to make time for professional development, things like universal design and technology as well. Admin, okay, sorry, here's the resource part. We have to have given time. We need resources, we need supports, we need assistance to be able to set up our courses accessibility. We need to develop those competencies. That decreases as we get those competencies. It becomes more fluid, we become more experienced. Admin and faculty, we need to challenge the status quo and the policies that reinforce it, looking at our supplementary regulations around progression and success, looking at those, challenging that narrative of time to complete and how long a graduate program should take, looking at reduced and part-time options and the length and the intensity of our programs. And we need to have diverse forces from the development of curricula, policies, and programs from conceptualization to implementation. Again, we need to look at other methods of inclusion or measuring inclusion beyond headcounts. We need underpinning pedagogical frameworks that support diverse learners, so universal design for learning, compassionate pedagogy, trauma-informed pedagogy, and decolonial and decolonizing pedagogies to be at the core. Challenging our narratives, making sure that there's diversity in hiring, beyond commitments to equity, who is at the front of the room? Who is teaching? Can students see themselves? We need to assist students and faculty in mentorship opportunities, in building relationships and creating safer spaces. We need to minimize that cognitive load on these students wherever possible. And we need to examine the policies around accommodations to minimize that burden. So the key takeaways are disabled students, and then as well, any other systematically oppressed or marginalized students face additional work, additional labor, additional load. They face isolation and educational challenges when we rely on an accommodation model to manage accessibility. Accommodations alone reinforce disability as deficit narratives and are inconsistent with the philosophies of our profession. And accessibility actually requires systematic and individual change, but would enable diverse participation in education. Okay, I know I whipped through those last ones. So there I have a few references, and I have some images references for my slides, and I'm going to end my show there, if I can remember how to do that. Okay, so with that, I'm guessing I can go stop sharing there. Are there any, I know I went really quickly. It was hard to get all of my ideas into an hour. Are there any comments, questions, challenges, disagreements? I'm open to all. None, we're done. Yay.
Oh, you're not done.
Of course not, Archie.
Of
course
you know,
not.
you presented, I think, a roadmap for not just for course, but for the university, and I'm thinking this needs to go higher up.
This was enough, Archie, for today. Thanks.
Well, you know, I'm just wondering about rattling Jeff Leclerc's cage.
I will rattle any cage as long as I don't have to always do it this way. This is the piece that intimidates me. You know me. I can get on my soapbox in different places, and as long as I can do that, that feels safer. But yes, it does. The university is so rooted in the way we've always done things, and so rooted in colonial practice and ableist practice and a single way of being from everything from how we admit students to how we progress them to how we convocate students. And we need to turn it on its ear, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work for actually more and more the majority of students.
You know, I'm thinking back to 2012, now ancient history, when the Cooper Commission was put together. And the kind of pushback that we got, even mentioning accessibility, you know, I think we've made progress during that time. But you know, the data that you have from SAS, I mean, and from learning, well, the whole student access piece of 1 to 400 ratio. There is no way that the people in SAS and student accessibility services that could even think about what we might do differently, because they're so busy trying to tread water and to keep not just their head above water, but their nose above water.
Yeah, they're facing an unreasonable burden, and I get it. And I know I've heard it from us, because this takes more time on our part. But, you know, my 5 hours or whatever, that's 25 hours of 5 of my students, right? That if I can flip that, I've now potentially taken some of that burden down from the students who are already sinking. So,
well, you've rattled our cage, Natalie, which is really good. So it's
thank you.
There are lots of good comments in the chat that you can take a look at, and I'm sure that this is just the beginning of a conversation that it's really important, and we need to move forward with. Yeah, rattle our cage. It's all good stuff. Okay. You didn't disappoint, my friend.
Thank you, Archie.
All very good.
I asked if I could share my slides with the group. Yes. I do have a couple of things to fix up that changed when I switched my format of my slides, because I did them in blank, and I want to make sure that I have my alt text done for all of my images. but I can certainly get those to Leanne, and she can send slides out if people want them. Most certainly. Are there any other questions? Excuse me. Crystal, I can't see who or where you are, but I have 3 neurodivergent kids, and it is part of why I do it. It's the students I'm working with, and it's the kids that I have at home. So I know the challenges that we've had for across their education in primary and secondary, and actually post-secondary education. So it is for them. Is there any questions, challenges, disagreements?
My goodness, a comment from Mark Garrett. Wow.
Mark and I have known each other for a long time. He's used to me being long and windy, so.
No, it was excellent.
There he is.
Fantastic, Natalie.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mark. I'm happy to talk about this one-on-one with anybody who wants to. This has definitely kind of become my passion in the last number of years as I've watched the students struggle. Let's talk. Thanks, Reg. All right. Well, thank you everybody for all your time today. Thank you to the students who are in here, because you're the reason I'm doing this. So, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon. I'm going to do some deep breathing now that this is done. So.
Good. Thank you, Natalie.